All right, Phyllis, we're rolling.
Just do it.
I have the privilege of introducing David once again. I'm Phyllis Frank. In 1995, I had the opportunity to fly across the country to take an anti-racism training in California. And you might wonder why anybody would go from New York, hotbed of anti-racism work, to California. And I did because I had spent more than 25 years going to anti-racism trainings that were, or multicultural trainings or diversity trainings, always looking to make sense of understanding racism and what it was about. And when a colleague said, try the Undoing Racism workshop presented by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, they're more political than touchy-feely, I said, well, that sounds right. When I got there, I had heard a lot about the Institute, and I had heard about Ron Chisholm, and it ended up that so many people had signed up, and they arbitrarily broke us into two groups, and I didn't get into Ron Chisholm's workshop. Subsequently, I've had that honor and privilege many times. I got David Billings and Barbara Major and thought I had the B team. It wasn't. Within 20 minutes of this workshop beginning, on a day that some challenges had happened to me that I was worried that I could be fully present, I was touched, I was riveted to my chair, and it was during the first presentation that was given by David. His telling of truth, his telling of history, set me and everyone else in that room upside down, and it was the beginning of really understanding what undoing racism means. And we will have another opportunity to hear some of that today. David Billings.
Thank you, Phyllis. You know, the People's Institute, again, we're community organizers, and we've been together for 24 years. The training team has grown, and the network has grown, and the analysis, I hope, has grown. And many of us, when we started, we're all community organizers. In our origins, we were often organizing directly in neighborhoods around issues of, particularly issues of housing and welfare rights. Those were the two kind of links. And many of us had been impacted by the work of housing advocates through the National Tenants Organizing and through welfare rights organizing, George Wiley and Jesse Gray, Ethel Green, Evelyn Green, lots of different organizers. And we were attempting to learn how to be more effective organizing. And as Ron often tells in his story, his introduction, Ron Chisholm, that we had been to or influenced by the great organizing schools that came out of Chicago, most of which were kind of in the Alinsky model of organizing, and we all learned a great deal. But they were white-led and well, you know, very political, very analytical, but they never talked about racism, never talked about it, wasn't a factor. And yet we knew in our own local work, whether it was in Yellow Springs, Ohio, where Jim Dunn and Diana Dunn were, whether it's in New Orleans, where Barbara Major and Ron Chisholm and I were, whether it was in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Michael Washington and Yasui Kawahara and Dan Buford were at that time, that race was always a factor. You know, the neighborhoods, the reason we were dealing with housing was because poor people of color were always confined to certain sections of the city that might have had a glorious history, but that history had been decimated through institutionalized racism. And yet the community organizers that we were a part of and had been trained by didn't talk about the racial nature of this power struggle. So whether it was the communities that Robert Moses was plowing through in New York City, you know, or Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the bomb had been dropped in the 1920s, or what's the town in Florida that they made the movie about? Rosewood. You know, those were real places, but they'd been eradicated from history. And as I was in New Orleans doing community work, social service, but I wanted to connect with these folks that I knew were residents of that community who were doing organizing. That was my desire. And so I would get grants, you know. And the concept of gatekeeping that the Institute talks about really came from our mutual work and reflecting back on it. That why was it so easy for me, who knew nothing about writing grants, who was 20-something years old at that time, but I could get a grant, be it from the United Methodist Church or City Hall, because I had an institution. We had a 501c3. The community folks could never get a grant, you know. They might, from a certain few foundations that saw themselves as having radical politics, get a small amount of money. But we could get programmatic grants. And so we began to say, well, who are these intermediaries that surround whatever language you use, oppressed communities, communities of color, and it's through them that the monies flow. It's through them. That's where the interns are assigned. That's where we go to practice. You know, when if you're in the ministry, as I was, the Christian ministry, you were usually out of seminary. You were either assigned to a country church, as we would call it, or to an urban church that was dying. You know, just had a few older white people in my case there. And we said, well, what's that about? You know, so the whole concept of gatekeeping, those of us who would learn to speak one way in community, speak a language that, you know, of revolution sometimes, you know, of cultural self-determination, of taking on City Hall and systemic racism, but would go to our funders, the United Methodist Church bishop, and talk about youth at risk, community, you know, underserved communities. Those communities weren't underserved. We were every other block. You couldn't walk outside of your house without tripping over one of us. And so when people in the Institute, the organizers, begin to say, well, y'all make money off of poor people, we resisted that notion. We served poor people. And they said, no, this community's a cash cow for you. If it was what you said you want it to become, you'd be out of business. So we had to struggle around that. And there was always race at the core of it. In New Orleans, it was the building of Interstate 10, right through the heart of one of the oldest, some say the oldest African-American community in the United States, Treme. Right down the cultural thoroughfare of that community, Claiborne Avenue, the largest concentration of African-American-owned businesses in the South. The cultural meeting point of Mardi Gras and what's called the Mardi Gras Indians and all the hundreds of years of cultural formation wiped out by city planners within a decade. And that was institutionalized racism. It was racial space theory, as we would later, there were spaces where, you know, it became that, you know, women of color lived in the project, men of color were living in the prisons. Then there was the whole homeless thing. So that everything had an understanding of race. And we had to begin to understand that and define it and then wrap a history around it to be more effective organizers. We never thought at that time that we would ever get into, say, the corridors of the system, the foot as we described it. We didn't even know we wanted to, because we always had a language that somehow that was, you know, you didn't do that. You'd get co-opted. But we began to understand through some of our work with other allies that if you don't have allies within these systems, within institutions, if you don't have schools of social work with faculty and administrators with clarity, if you don't have people in health care that understand that racism is an independent health care factor in this country, that you die younger, you die of more different, you can't get anywhere. The system overwhelms you. so that all of the community organizing that you can do, you're constantly butting up against this power arrangement. So we understood you have to have allies within institutions, and because of civil rights movements and other movements in this country, people were now in some of those positions that they had historically been locked out of. So how do you make those connections? Became a real way. And so that's why we had to start studying, what makes institutions work? One of the more recent learnings for us, and many of people in this room would know this. We didn't know it as well because we had concentrated our efforts in other places. But in every systemic arrangement, they're validating entities. I don't mean that negatively. Until those validators sign off, the system doesn't move. In some arenas, they're publications that are kind of bellwether. Usually there's kind of, in most systems, there's kind of a conservative voice, if you will, on one hand, a more progressive or radical voice on the other. But there are these validating entities. They're schools, certain universities. They're certain individuals. So that when the Journal for the American Medical Association, I was telling a couple of you this story, and I sometimes use it in the workshop, in the fall of 2000, said that racism was an independent health risk factor in the United States. Because of the status of that journal in the medical field, we began to get work all over the United States in the healthcare system, the Centers for Disease Control, places like this that we had never thought we could reach, but were now reaching out to us, and you'd trace it back to this article. Now, people had been saying that who had been working in community, but it had not been, quote, validated. So at the point of validation, then the system begins to say, now you can budget, now you can teach, now you can publish, now you can set aside resources for training, now you can second people to certain arenas, and all of a sudden you have this welling up systemically. What usually happens because of the race divides, and one of the primary purposes of race is to keep those most oppressed by race from institutional access. So when the university starts moving, for example, because of internalized racism on the part of individuals, because of institutional racism on the part of the systems, then there's no connect between what's going on in academia with community. But our experience was that without community support, you can't make systems change. You can have beautiful theorists, you can have incredible writers who basically talk to small groups of people, but without a community organizing itself to pressure and back up those who are doing that, nothing changes. But the intent of the construct is to disconnect, to take away what I think in academia is called applied, is that what it's called? Applied work or something like that. And there's a history to that. Because the university, if you just think, some of us who are in our 50s and remember the teach-ins of the 1960s around the Vietnam War and other things, remember the crucial role of university and community. Well, part of the counter-revolution, if you will, is to bust that up and bust it up good. Separate community from academia. Separate students from professors. Separate administrators from staff. We get a lot of requests from people who say, we want to do an Undoing Racism workshop. I say, well, why? Well, we'd like to establish the beloved community. Say, okay, well, let's all get together and do it. Say, well, we just want the administrators to do it first. Say, oh, you don't beloved your staff. We're afraid to mix, yet we're going to be talking about how to do it on a larger level. We can't do it in our particular levels, or some of the dynamics in schools of social work. And I don't know all the reasons, but they're, so, well, we want to meet, but we can't have students. We have to be able to reflect back on that and say, well, why is it? Might be good reasons, but it mitigates against, in some ways, what we're trying to do. So I want to speak more about that in a minute, but all of this stuff has origins. A lot of people will talk about the origins of the concept of race, and I alluded to it earlier, but see, these things were building over many, what will become race will start as, if you use the Christian church, the concept of Christendom, which meant that Christianity was going to, they didn't use the term conquer the world, but that's really what it was meant, that the world was to be Christendom, and that not only would missionaries be sent out to make this happen, but that Christendom would be seen in an overall approach to what constitutes civilization. What for many years was referred to as people who would later become racially categorized would go through a couple of centuries or more than that of being called heathen, savage, infidel, uncivilized, all of the non-Christian, non-baptized. And that's just one approach of a major cultural power, culturally sanctioned institution that would lay the groundwork for the concept of race. Goodness associated with that which is angelic and white. I'm white-robed. I've been bleached white as snow is still one of the Methodist hymn book songs. How all black congregation, we all singing, Lord, bleach me white as snow. So, but this was a mindset. It was something that was taught. It divided the world into categories of who was fully a person, fully humane, what constituted civilized ways of being, who could be, quote, saved. By the time the race construct, so when will be emerging, there had been centuries of work. If you want to read, he was a New York federal judge. He died a few years ago, Leon Higginbotham. I don't know how many of you know his name, but he wrote in The Matter of Color. He will dissect from a legal standpoint, in minutia, the origins of the race construct in the United States from a legal standpoint. He'll basically study Massachusetts and Virginia. He will say that it will be the experience of the Massachusetts colonial experience or colony and Virginia that will serve as the basis for the racial construct of the United States. The reason you don't ever read about this is that race had not yet been created. But there are these notions embedded in the Constitution, for example, of who is a human being. That's where you get the 3/5 clause and the Indians not taxed. This is where the justification will occur that says the manifest destiny of the white race, which used to not be apologized for. They used to say that. It is the destiny of the white race, and white Christians in particular, to conquer the world. This is God's will and intent. Because the native peoples are of the land, but they're on the land, but they're not of the land. They're like the buffalo. They don't do anything for it. They just are there. They're not fully consciously human. They can be eradicated, but it's not morally evil to do so. The classic works, if you read in the much more honest than they are today. If you read Ashley Montague's Man's Greatest Myth, the origins of race. Thomas Gossett, Race, the invention of an idea. If you read Audrey Smedley, who's still teaching at Virginia Wesleyan, I think, but she used to be at Syracuse, or one of the SUNY schools, Race in North America. They will trace the origins, because what the race constructionists will be doing is that racism will have its roots in Europe, but the pilot project will be the United States, to think of it that way. This is where it's first kind of being formatted. It's then going to be exported around the world. Colonialism, imperialism. It's going to be, and the assumption is white supremacy, Christianity, capitalism, all very much linked together into a mindset that says the world and its resources, in order to fully actualize, are ours. We can bring civilization and order to it. It is our calling. It is our destiny. So that will spread worldwide. The folks that are associated with the creation of the concept of race, often, there are many of them, they're not in all the same place. These are much like your work. They're writers, they're theorists, they're in different locations. They're somehow communicating and are aware of each other, but they're not all in one place. But they're being influenced by historical dynamics, economic dynamics, improvements in technology that allow the European nations to travel the world. What Johann Blumenbach and Louis Leclerc Buffon, I think is his name, they're also, interestingly enough, referred to as the fathers of Western anthropology. They also will invent, along with others, the concept of race. Now, what are they doing? They're very aware, for example, that oppression, based on all sorts of things, has been existing for a long time. That people's treating each other differently on the basis of religion or culture or ethnicity or region, been worldwide. They're trying to supersede that. They're trying to put an umbrella over it. That as we would say, trumps anything else. And what they're trying to do is justify the European interactions with, quote, the colored peoples of the world. What their challenge is, they might even have received a grant for it. I can imagine, begin 3 years study they're saying justify it according to Europe's own standard of morality, understanding of the law, question of what of theology. In every moral formation of the best of European mindset, justify the extermination of the indigenous peoples of the world. Justify the enslavement of African peoples, which was unique. See, no one had ever experienced what the peoples of Africa experienced during the formation of white supremacy. Not only just the horrors of all of that, and its middle passage and its decimation to a peoples and a continent, but African peoples were removed from the family of humankind by white supremacy. They were turned into real estate so that they could be bargained as horses and cows on the stock market. They were commodities. They were no longer human. They were property. So whiteness, as it evolves, is politically very much a property right. See, whiteness is a property right. I am owed this. This is mine. And it will culminate, the two extremes of whiteness in this country is who is to be considered white? Who is to be considered a Negro? Blumenbach and Buffon in their theory will say that all other peoples, be they the indigenous of New Zealand and Australia, or the many peoples of Asia. Blumenbach and Buffon will say, yeah, but they're exotic variations on the norm. Exotic variations, meaning the real struggle on the power poles will be who's going to be white, who's going to be a Negro, because the indigenous are going to be exterminated. See, that's why they don't have to count. But black people are going to be used to build the economy. The indigenous people's lands are necessary for the economy. You push the indigenous away or out and over. That's your land capital. You, quote, enslave the African. That's your human capital, or in their case, subhuman. And that's your economic base. See, that is the money that is going to fuel in the United States the industrial and manufacturing revolution. How are you going to import and pay low-wage European workers? How are you going to keep the wages low? In part, you're going to do that by having, at first, an enslaved class of people, and later a racially oppressed class of people who are left out of the economic arrangement altogether, who will constantly be that threat used in the same way as the exporting of U.S. jobs are today. Constantly the threat. If you don't accept your lot for what it is, we got some people who have been left out altogether who are willing to be paid less than you for an opportunity that you now have. And that's how you keep people separated and divided. Because the South didn't have any banks, all of the resources that were 100%, 500% profit, no wage. You don't have no overhead. So your profits are enormous. But where are those profits going? See, they're going to Boston, Philadelphia, and New York City. And those banks and those financial institutions will spread westward with the resources that are made on free native land, oppressed black labor. White working class, frustrated and oppressed, but held by white skin privilege. What separates the white working class from the native, the quote, Indian, the Chinese as they were called, or the Negro, was race skin privilege. So that those white people who couldn't take advantage of race skin privilege or didn't take advantage were called trash, garbage, unnecessary, because there was a psychology that said, this is for you, and you've blown it. You're trifling, no good, low account. You can't blame race because you got race privilege. And you haven't been able to pull yourself up. You live in like the colored folks. That's how they'd say down south. So in the North did not have an apartheid system that was legally rooted, but it had an apartheid system that was socially and economically rooted. So that peoples of color, as they either were in the North or the Midwest, would be separated out, even as they would have a semblance of rights. Those rights were always at the behest of the dominant culture. See, ever since the origins of this country, the only citizenry that the U.S. military has ever been called out to deal with have been either white people who were trying to organize around workers' rights back in the day, early part of the 20th century, or peoples of color. This is a mindset that Andrew Jackson understood that led to the Trail of Tears. See, at first, white people said, people who became white, we're not interested in going across the Appalachians. We just want to stay here. White people never just stay here. We move every time Starbucks opens or new chocolatier comes into town. We now want that neighborhood. Well, that's a mindset that's way back. I want the land. I'll move from the land, but I'll take it back. Gentrification, all these sort of things. The reason the cities of this country fare better when more white people stay in them is because the construct is built on that assumption. You leave a city or a school system or an institution or an organization, as it becomes more than kind of 30% people of color, the resources that built it begin to go away. You know? And so the Andrew Jackson said to his poor white constituency, who now wanted the land that had been promised to the Cherokee, the Creek, not the Seminoles, a whole nother story. But that promise had been made. Choctaw had been said, as long as the wind blows and the sun shines, you've heard it, this is yours. We don't want beyond the southern Appalachia, but now we do. So when they come down, they say, well, there's treaties that prevent it. That's where the Supreme Court case will come in. But Jackson, who's their organizer, says, Chief Justice Marshall has made his law. Let's see him enforce it. Eisenhower will face the same dilemma after Brown versus Board. And what he means by that is, let's see if the United States government is willing to call out its military to oppose the very people who they need to be in the military in order to take the Western lands. Jackson is saying this nation will not turn its guns on the very people who they need to keep the, quote, race construct in place. The Trail of Tears, then, is that removal, that Indian removal policy that moves the folks off the land promised. This psychology of white supremacy, it will move west. But it's the origins of race, which don't come to around 1795. Blumenbach, Buffon, and others, this is a whole century after the creation of white. White was created, as much as we know, in 1690, 91. Virginia and Maryland will create a status, a category of people that heretofore had not existed, and that was that of a white person. Virginia will debate it, say, well, what's a white person? And they'll say, well, a white person is any person who is from any of the indigenous countries of Europe, something like that. And then they say, I have the thing. Virginia's anti-miscegenation statute had gone through several revisions. In one, white person was defined as someone who had no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian, with a special exemption aimed at protecting descendants of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. Now, what the hell does that mean? It's just a sentence. But what that meant was that John Rolfe, the tobacco magnate, when tobacco was the same as cash, married an indigenous woman whose name is given in history as Pocahontas, which meant that their children would not be white, but if the law remained the same, would inherit the land that was just stolen from them, since he owned most of it. So they changed the law, which is where the power comes in, and it says, white person is any person who has no blood whatsoever. They didn't use Caucasian at that time. That was the translation. No blood other than that of the European nations, quote, comma, except for the descendants of John Rolfe and Pocahontas. Is a rider attached. We're going to give him his break, you know. So this concept of race that white will be created in 1690. The concept of a colored person, a Negro, will begin to come into the vernacular. And an Indian, as we all know, will be a made-up term to collectivize the indigenous peoples of America, of the Americas. The justification of this, Blumenbach and Buffon, will be later to say this can be morally defended, this can be legally defended, this can be scientifically defended, and it can be defended in terms of what is conceived as the will of God. And it gives its legitimacy to the concept. And they will say, if you understand race, and then they will divide all the peoples into various categories of race. White, or what will later be called Caucasian, always being the top, the others in relationship to it. So race is about a pecking order. It's solely about what's your relationship to power, you know. So that's its origins. And you read those great works. If you read the writings of Jefferson and people like that, they're in a dilemma, not only because of what they do after school and everything, but also what they think, you know, because they know they're torn around the immorality and the evilness of what is evolving, given what they say is their goal and their ideals, the disconnect, the contradiction. So there's this huge body of writing that's going on with people debating, you know, whether or not this is right or not. Blumenbach and Buffon are attempting to give scientific imprimatur to the fact that they are lesser, inferior peoples. And we need not apologize for it, it's just a given. Thus, it is not only right that those fully human and fully civilized people conquer them, it's in their best interest. See, and that's what will do it. So there's a lot more that can be said about that, but that's the mindset. It will carry itself all over the world, where you will find this color coding of the world, basically, that will take place, not always using the terminology of race, but always the power arrangement of it, you know. So the construct is a fascinating one. I think the last thing that I want to talk about, because it intrigues me, and there's so many of you doing this work. Some of you are doing the theorist work and the academic and the writing of history, which is good. And others of you are doing it in community and through organizations. And we have to, as we were sharing with some of you, I think we have to develop a theory of social change. We have to study it. How does the nation change? Because this nation has changed. There are times when it's changed. What was going on in those times? We've been a part, some of us in a room like this, we've been a part of those great changes. We shouldn't belittle them, I don't think, because they didn't do all that they could have done. Because those were folks just like ourselves who were working in very difficult times and who made some great changes, even as they didn't get it all right. But we don't have it all right either. And one of our most disturbing elements, I think, of internalized racial superiority is that we eat our children. We so tear each other down that we can't put ourselves back together. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't disagree in dialogue, but how can we build on each other's work so that it is not so defaming or critical of each other, so that we can learn? And we particularly, a lot, I say on the left because I've been more involved in that. I grew up on the right, but I've been more involved on the left. But how do we not do that? Because it serves the interest of the very things that we say that we want to change. But there have been times when there's great movement, and those of us called white have always been a part of those movements. You know, that's why white anti-racists need to do their own studies of history, because there have always been people who have called white, who've opposed this race construct and have spoken out against it and organized. We don't see them mentioned very much, but they're women and men, and they're young people and old, and they're very prominent throughout history, but we don't lift their names up as much as we should. In our own work, we don't celebrate each other as much as we should, and realize that some of the stuff we're doing is historic. But one of the things, I read someplace, and I can't find it. It's somewhere. You ever had that problem? I don't know how those of you who do research and can document everything. I'll be making stuff. Anyway, people say, well, you're lying. Where'd you I said, well, I'm not lying. I just can't prove it. I said, you go find it. Well, I read this because it intrigued me. I couldn't have made it up. It didn't sound that interesting. They said 1949, the Ford Foundation, and this is before you have the national foundations. 49 basically only have the Rockefeller Fund that sees itself as being huge. Carnegie was into it, but Ford was still sort of based in Michigan. But this is what they do. They called together after World War II a meeting, sort of like this, and here's the topic of the meeting. How can we preserve the social order in this country, given the threat that alien ideologies, communism, project, and ask men and women of color to return from fighting a Second World War and return to Jim Crow apartheid? How are we going to ask how are we going to be able to reintegrate a white working class yet again, who've died disproportionately in yet another war, to a system that oppresses you on the basis of your wages, your conditions, the fact that you are a laborer. So you got labor, and you've got people of color who are also labor, but labor usually referred to white labor. People of color, always people of color. It don't matter, they Negroes or they Indians, but But white people have some distinctions about them. So there's workers. How are you going, when there's this alien ideology out there, how are you going to preserve a social order without it boiling over? The world is going through all these changes. There's hints that Africa is going to throw off colonialism. There's evidences that tiny bands of Vietnamese and Chinese have overthrown and resisted great powers. There's all of this world, times they are changing, and Dylan will write about that a decade or so later. So Ford calls together and says basically this: we have got to loosen it up. We've got to humanize, this is not their language, the construct, without changing the basic order of things. We got to open up rights and possibilities. We got to build wages, but we can't throw away what is, quote, made us great. They will have, I'd love to find the minutes of that, because see, those think tanks, later we'll call them think tanks, those coming together of people working at that level. There's some of us who are paid to kind of look at the broader scope of things. And they have political ramifications. That will later, those kind of influences, you can see trends in the discussions in the Congress when you read the congressional record, and I did find some of that. And a lot of that discussion will be what will lead to, the 501c3 and everything, the knowledge that Jim Crow was going to be found unconstitutional. Ever since Charles Houston agreed to go down to Howard and form the law school there, and he got a commitment from those who were trying to bring him to Howard to say, I want the law school to exist for one purpose. Give me enough resources to train enough lawyers to take on Jim Crow and demolish it. That was a wonderful charge that he had, and a wonderful career that he had in training a cadre of lawyers, the best known of which was Thurgood Marshall, that took on Jim Crow. It's one of the most untold, greatest impact change in this nation's history, the work of Charles Houston. So this movement, and I got to wrap it up, but this movement, the world is changing, the United States is changing. It's not that we should compare who was the greater, I don't think. Dr. King and Ella Baker and all of those greats, so they were organizing in their context. Malcolm and others were organizing in theirs, but every one of them lived every day of their lives with a death threat on their head. See, and unless you live your life like that, I suggest you back up a bit in deciding, well, who was really the heaviest. There's, please. But, everybody was doing this work. It was culminating. At the same time, there's a counter movement going on. At the very time that the civil rights movement is evolving, black consciousness is evolving through the work of people like Malcolm X and great writers like Franz Fanon and others. There's this counter movement that is also organizing. Doesn't get a lot of attention. One of its bellwethers later on will be that starts in the early 1950s, who won't gain national prominence until the early 1970s, is Ronald Reagan. See, I would contend that it was not Jack Kennedy so much that first learned how to use the medium as the message as it was Ronald Reagan. When he was hired by General Electric to have that Saturday morning radio show, he began to have an audience of conservative things that set the stage both for the Goldwater run and for his own presidency. Reagan really knew how to work the media, and he exemplified Americana in its male imaging of itself. So this counter movement would evolve alongside. The counter movement will understand, I think, it doesn't understand power better. It just understands power as ultimately it now holds sway. And that was, the civil rights movement is going to impact the law. But those who make the law are those who sit in the Congress and who occupy the presidency. With the assassination of Kennedy and the election of Johnson, the right wing in this country was in a descendant posture. If you can believe it, there were those in the late 60s the mid-60s who thought the Republican Party was dead and buried and over. That Goldwater had so embarrassed it was finished. But there were all of those who felt like, okay, these laws are being passed. Right now there's this ascendancy. But there's this other movement that says you've got to look to the long haul. You've got to control the presidency of the United States because the president appoints the judiciary. You've got to be concerned about the Congress and thus the lines that are drawn. And you can see going along. Nixon, for example, remember, he'll quit in the early 60s. Remember, he's through. America hadn't treated him right. They don't appreciate it. And he will have young people basically coming out of Southern Cal, Haldeman, Ehrlichman. They were young once. The guy that's now the Christian evangelical, Colson. All these folks will tell Nixon to hold up. He'll learn some from George Wallace. Basically what he learns is take out the race baiting, the in talk, all of that ugliness, but speak to the frustrations of the white working class who are losing their sons and daughters to a counterculture and can't predict their future. Speak to those issues and don't race bait. You can be president of the United States. The whole kind of silent majority phrase will emerge out of a thinking process of young conservatives who are saying that you have to appeal to the frustration of whites whom this nation has made some promises to and is in danger of not being able to keep them. That still resonates throughout our country. The left has a very difficult time speaking to the frustrations of the white working class, leaves them to those forces who want to turn back the clock. By the time that, Watergate was a mistake, and they didn't mean to get caught, and thus Carter would never have happened. There would have been a long, continuous line of what we're now dealing with. Because of Watergate, there was a blip in it. So that these counter forces would regain the presidency, be able to appoint to the Supreme Court. On the progressive end of things, we started funding programs. Conservatives understood, you don't have all these little right-wing programs on the corner. You got all these help, we run those, but it doesn't challenge the arrangement. Social services might be necessary, but it keeps the power arrangement in place. So that you have to understand the race construct to understand why was the appeal, why is the appeal what it is. Because many of the white working class will support that system which oppresses them more than cast their lot with those with whom they have more in common. You can't understand that without understanding what is the appeal of a race-constructed society and the privileges and benefits that come from that. So that this thing that we're in the midst of right now as a people, and I think, as someone said at lunch, we're always at watershed points in our history. But certainly we continue to be in one. And we're going to be at, because the election of the presidency is so important, and yet so many of us see that as being sort of insignificant, so that we don't put our resources towards trying to win that vote. We just complain after that vote is miscounted. But there is no question that we have the capacity, because we're so close, if we could put our energies, but everything we do mitigates against that, because come Monday morning, you'll have more on your plate than you can barely address. And it keeps us from coalescing even in our own interests. Thank you very much. You've been a good audience.